let's get straight to the story. This is a wonderful elk hunting story. So, the trip took place in the early 90s, when the elk population in the West Kootenays was at its finest. The hunt began on a beautiful, crisp fall day, the beginning of October, if I remember right. I was a young teen, and my dad and my Uncle Harv in their 40s. We headed out to try and harvest an elk. We made our way up winding, narrow logging roads typical of the Kootenays, with potholes and bumps bouncing us around. When we finally arrived, we unloaded our ATV as well as a couple of dirt bikes and headed far into the mountains as we could go. We had a special place in mind that allowed you to get to an area where there were perfect open slides with alpine above. "Oh, this is elky country," I said, and we parked those bikes and started hiking up an old skid trail. We had an elk bugle, but back in those days, elk bugles looked a lot different than they do now, let me tell you. Now, there's all sorts of different brands and styles. There are reeds that can mimic young bulls, old bulls, as well as cows and calves. Back then, there were reeds, but they were very hard to get a consistent sound out of. I think they had just been invented, and my dad had an old metal whistle call that looked like a small wind instrument, kind of like a mini tuba without the bell. And it sounded like a cheap recorder we used to get in music class back in elementary school. It didn't get the deep sound, but you could get a really good top-end squeal through it. And, if the elk were heavy in the rut, then it usually worked. Okay, so we hiked our way along, keeping track of the wind and looking for the perfect spot to bugle from. We made it up to a vantage point that we could see across some open areas towards the slides. This country is absolutely amazing and hard to express the beauty of it in words. We were probably up around 7,000 or 8,000 feet in the Selkirk Mountains that are just slightly smaller but completely resemble the Rocky Mountains. At that elevation, the trees are smaller and open up to some meadows and fresh-growing avalanche snowslides. The first bugle was let out, and we sat and patiently waited. When you're up in the high country, it's amazing how sound travels. We let out a few more bugles, and sure enough, way off in the distance, we heard a faint bugle. I was getting excited. There is nothing that beats the sound of an elk bugle. Moose and deer sure didn't develop a very majestic sound, and don't even compare. "It's on its way," I said to my dad and uncle. Over the next half hour, that elk worked its way down the mountain, and the whole while getting more and more riled up. It was so exciting to hear that bugle get louder and louder as it made its way in. We were all set up, hunkered down with a nice gun rest, but sure enough, like a lot of bulls do, this one hung up, just out of our sight, right at the edge of the bush. It started raking the trees with its antlers and wouldn't come a step closer. You could see the trees moving, but you couldn't see the elk. At that point, my dad moved down below us and grabbed a big stick and started scratching and hitting a tree with it. Well, I was thinking, what the heck is he doing? Shouldn't we be as quiet as we can so as not to spook the elk? But my dad knew. He knew that cagey elk needed more encouragement and more proof that there was a rival bull elk in his area. The bugle wasn't enough. He wanted to see and hear the bush and the trees being raked by antlers. Well, my dad didn't have any antlers, but he knew a stick would do, and sure enough, that got the elk to step out. He stepped right out into the open, gave a beautiful call, and started heading straight towards us. This was one of the most majestic things I've ever seen in my life. Now, this was a nice mature bull with a lot of tines. Uncle Harv was ready. With a perfect rest, I heard him let out his breath and squeeze the trigger. Boom! One shot is all it took, as Uncle Harv put a really good shot into that elk. It ran only a few meters and went down. Well, that was pretty darn exciting. This was a nice bull. We waited a while for him to pass peacefully and made our way over to where he lay. Well, wouldn't you know it, he had somehow managed to roll down a big depression and land in a stump hole, as we were in a previously logged area. It was going to be very awkward and very difficult place to field dress him and get him out of. So, you might be saying, hey, that's not a bad story, but what the heck, guys? A lot of people bugle in an elk and, have to field dress it or get it out of a rough spot. But it's this next part that is a very rare occurrence and starting to get scary. Now, I only had my trusted 30-30 with me because I was a pretty young back then, and it was a perfect deer gun for me in the thick bush of the Kootenays. Since the bull was down in this hole, it was my job to be our lookout in case we had any visitors that we didn't want, like grizzly bears. And sure enough, a few minutes later, there was a mighty crashing in the nearby bush line. Well, no, wait a minute, maybe it's another bull coming in. No. Out of that crashing bush came a bear. He stood up on his hind legs, sniffing the air. It was easy to see it was a large silver-tip grizzly. It had a head on it, and it was sniffing the air, and I let the guys know we had a visitor, and he did not look happy. In fact, I think he looked hungry. My dad came up and switched guns with me, saying his 7mm Magnum was a better fit. Watch our backs, he told me, and that is what I did, although I was feeling a little nervous. But not as nervous as I was about to feel. For believe it or not, suddenly there was more crashing in the bush to the other side. Okay, well, maybe this time it's an elk coming in from the calls we made earlier. But once again, no. It was another silver-tip grizzly coming in from the smell of the dead elk or the sound of the rifle shot. You know, it's debated that if a grizzly hears a boom and then comes across an elk carcass, how many times does that need to happen before he puts two and two together and hears a gunshot as a dinner bell? Anyways, back to our story. The second grizzly was even bigger than the first. A real brute, let me tell you. I've seen a lot of grizzlies and this thing was massive. His nose told him exactly where we were and he was staring straight at us. Both bears started walking back and forth, not coming closer, but pacing and clicking their teeth together. If you've ever had two big grizzlies staring at you, chomping their teeth together, well, it's a nerve-wracking experience, let me tell you. So that's when we said, there is no way we can stay here. So Uncle Harv headed back down to get his quad. We figured if we could get his quad close, we could hook onto the elk and skid it out of there and hopefully speed up the process. So while he was gone, we guarded that elk. Those grizzly bears had a natural fear of us humans, but the smell of elk blood was making them braver and braver. They came closer, continuing with their scare tactics of chomping their teeth together. And in fact, that was working really well because I was starting to get very scared. We blasted off a few shots with our rifles into the air, and that kept them from coming any closer, but we knew we didn't have long. You see, in Canada, it's the law that you're not allowed to use any harmful means to protect your meat from a bear. If the bear runs you off the carcass, then you run off the carcass. You are not allowed to shoot or injure the bear in any way. Okay, back to the story. When the quad arrived with very considerable effort, we got it in close to the moose just as the bears were starting to circle around and act even more aggressive. We threw a winch cable down in the hole, hooked onto the elk, and I don't know if it was willpower, prayer, or a miracle, but that little quad yanked that elk right out of the hole without even stopping for a second. My dad and I jumped on the quad and said, go, just go, 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 go. So in one swift movement, we pulled that elk right out of the hole and all the way down to the truck as the grizzlies came in to eat the guts. It was a real good example of why you have to be careful when hunting and how amazing it is to have two mountain men with you. As nervous as I was, I knew I had two of the best, most experienced hunters in the Kootenays with me. And that elk ended up being a 7x8. It was an older elk, no longer in his prime, and his antlers were starting to go smaller. But the meat on that elk filled our freezers. Well, but for now, let's get straight into the story. It was a beautiful fall morning. One of those days you just can't wait to go hunting. Very little snow, but a thick frost on the grass and a freezing chill in the air. Mid-November, and from past experience, I knew the whitetail bucks were in the rut. Not to mention, I had seen good track and some antler rubs last time I was out. Today just felt like the day, and I invited my hunting partner Chris Funk to come along. Chris is a great friend of mine. We grew up together and have shared many hunting experiences. You'll hear more about him again. So, we drove down the pitch-black dark roads of northern Alberta, Drayton Valley country to be exact. It wasn't a far drive, but I wanted the timing to be perfect, so we'd arrive just before first light. We were totally prepared, and I was decked out with my bolt-action .243, bullets, skinning knife, binoculars, warm clothes, and a snack. Now, Chris and I hunt a lot, and when the freezers start getting full, well, then we start to get picky on the size of buck we take. Both of us have trophies on the wall, but we're always looking for another beautiful, bigger whitetail. When we arrived, we had a quick discussion on just how big the buck would have to be to get us to pull the trigger. Well, I think we shouldn't shoot unless the buck looks like at least a score of 140, I said. Our standards weren't too high, and to tell you the truth, the freezers weren't that full, and I probably would have taken a 130. Now, I'm sure most of you listeners know this, but for those of you that don't, all antlered animals' antlers can be measured to create a numerical score that represents the size and beauty of the antlers. It's a combination of width, height, diameter, number of points, how symmetrical or non-symmetrical they are. If you don't know about this, I encourage you to research it as it's very interesting. This is the number you would use to enter it into the record books if it qualified, or the number you could tell your friends so they knew just how big a buck you had taken. All right, back to our story. Now, setting your sights on a certain size buck, like a big buck compared to any buck, makes the hunt much more difficult. For it seems like as soon as you make that statement, 2 and 3 point bucks start jumping out all over. I knew it was going to take some time, and I was ready to have all the patience in the world and enjoy my adventure with my old friend. We parked the truck, enjoyed our last sips of coffee, and started heading up a promising trail. The country here is rolling hills with scattered poplar forests, trails, and farmland. We were only about 400 yards in, and this area is looking good. I mean really good. We came up upon a ravine with 4 different cut lines intersecting about 170 yards away. I knew I didn't have to go any further. The time was right, the day was right, the place was right, and Lord willing and the creek don't rise, I'm going to get myself a big whitetail. I'm staying right here, I said to Chris with an authoritative dibs on that spot. No problem, Chris said, and headed off to find his own perfect spot. I literally sat down right there, right where I was standing. There was a skinny little poplar tree for me to half hide behind and use as a gun rest to steady my shot. Good enough, I thought, as the sound of Chris's crunchy steps had disappeared into the distance, and I got ready to sit still and be patient. I'm glad I'm a patient man, because you would not believe how long I had to wait until something happened. 15 minutes. Yeah, it was just one of those days. 15 minutes and this doe comes out into the open intersection. She seemed distracted, concerned, not looking towards me, but watching behind her as if something was following. Well, she had a look in her eye. Her tail was raised high, and I could just tell by looking at her and the time of year that that doe was in heat. And there's a darn good chance it's a buck that's following her. So she turned and started walking straight towards me. She had no idea I was there and seemed very distracted by her suitor. Then she turned and ran down the ravine that I was overlooking. Snap! I heard a sound and my eyes shot back to where I first had seen the doe. Well, sure enough, a nice set of antlers came walking out of the bush. He stood exactly where that doe had been, looking longingly off in her direction. I knew he wouldn't stand there for long, and I only had a few seconds to make up my mind. His antlers looked nice, but they were obscured by the willows and poplars behind him, and I couldn't really tell just how big they were. But what the heck, must be over our previously decided upon standard of 140. Up came my .243 rifle, and with the rest on that poplar, I quickly had his chest in the crosshairs of my 3x9 scope. Boom! I shot. That deer just stood there. He just lifted his leg, thumped it back down, and stood there. Are you kidding me? I couldn't have missed at that range with this rifle. Then he turned and ran down the exact path the doe had taken, which was straight towards me. Okay, well, this is getting even easier, I thought, and at about 70 yards I shot again, this time hitting him square in the chest. Well, that took the legs right out from under him. He face planted into the snow and snow plowed right up to a big clump of trees. So his antlers were still pretty much obscured. Whoa, now that was exciting. With my heart pounding, I thought I'll wait here and give him the time to pass. Some of you non-hunters out there may not understand this practice. If you've made a good shot on an animal, it's best to just wait. Sit down and wait. Now, this is very difficult. Your adrenaline is flowing, excitement is in the air, but an experienced hunter knows, don't run, don't chase. If he was to run up to that buck right away, the buck, in seeing him, would more than likely have a surge of adrenaline, jump up and run even further away, possibly not to be found. But when you wait, when you leave him be, he will know he's mortally wounded, lay down, bleed out, and pass peacefully. So, I'm waiting. The usual rule of thumb is to wait 10 to 15 minutes. And after you've had that exciting of a time, 10 minutes can seem like an hour, let me tell you. But I continued to remain quiet and still, staring at the spot where I had seen the buck go down. Then, just 4 inches from my right ear, I hear a raspy whisper. "Hey, Evan!" Holy jeez, you scared the crap out of me. How that friend of mine could walk up behind me without making even a single sound, I do not know. But let me tell you, that Chris is one sneaky hunter in the bush. And I suppose my focus must have been very intent. Plus, I think my ears were still ringing. Okay, whew, now that he scared the crap out of me and my heart and adrenaline is back up to 1 million, and it's been a little bit of time, let's go take a look and see what kind of a buck I got. Chris was really excited for me, and as we got about 60 yards away, he stated, "Oh, hey, that looks not bad. That must be at least 140. "Well, of course it is," I said. "Wasn't that our agreement?" We walked a little closer. "No, that's a 150, Chris estimated. Well, I was getting really excited. Because most of the time when you shoot a buck, it looks huge in the scope, and after the shot, as you get closer to it, it starts shrinking. It's a phenomenon us hunters call ground shrinkage. What you think is a giant buck in your scope, by the time you get to it, it's just a small 4-point. Okay, but not this time. The closer we got, the more tines we seen. We walked a little closer. "That could be a 160, he said. And with 3 more steps, "I bet it's a 170. Well, now I'm getting really excited. The buck was still alive, and I finished him off with a round to the neck. Chris and I spent the rest of the morning field dressing that beautiful buck. We took our time and we caped his head out nicely. "He's a real big one. This one's going on my wall," I announced with pride. Well, Chris and I just couldn't stop smiling and laughing as we worked in the sunshine. I kept the antlers, the meat, the hide. I do all my own butchering, and I was incredibly thankful for our good fortune and easy hunt. So yeah, this first story is about coyote hunting. I loved hunting coyotes, and in fact, this is the weapon that I used to do it. That is one beautiful thunder stick, and we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. First off, let's get into the story. The year was 1992, and I would have been 22 years old at that time. I absolutely loved hunting coyotes. Now, where I grew up in the Kootenays of British Columbia, there was a lot of coyotes. We had an abundance of coyotes, and shooting coyotes was never any kind of harm on their population, let me tell you that. Now, I was just, a young, very young man, more of a kid really, and growing up in the bush there, and this is before YouTube, this is before anything like that. The only coyote hunting that I knew to do is if you seen one, you could blast the sucker, or if maybe you came across a kill somewheres, or one time I came across an elk that had actually gotten trapped in the mud and died there, and then there was coyotes coming around. So we'd look for these opportunistic times. We didn't have at the time, and I know they existed, but perhaps they existed, but we didn't know at the time, and none of us, myself or my friends, were using calls, or nowadays they even have decoys, rattling a tail and making a call, or you can bring these coyotes in. Well, we never had any of that. We were just opportunistic hunters, like I said. So one day, I was sitting on my porch, and I could hear off in the distance a coyote howling. Making all those crazy sounds that they make, it's impossible to imitate, but you've all heard it before. And he's not that far away, and it's in the middle of the day. So I know this coyote, I know exactly what he's doing. He's sitting over there on the mountainside there, about half a mile away, and he's squawking away, and he's trying to draw dogs out to him, right? I got a little dog. I had neighbors about a mile down the road. They got a couple dogs, and I knew this coyote, he's trying to draw those dogs out, get them to the edge of the bush, come on out and attack them and eat them, right? So I thought, I'm going to spoil his plans. I'm up to his game. So I had a little dog myself. And it was a little hunting dog, although it's a small dog. It's a smooth-haired fox terrier. It's got to be my most favorite breed of dog. And this story is one of my most favorite because this dog ended up being my best hunting partner I ever had. And this is how it all started. So with this little dog, smooth-haired fox terrier, weighing in at about 14 pounds, and we all know that coyotes are going to easily weigh twice that much. Not much for a coyote hunting dog, but this dog wanted to come with me everywhere I went. So I grabbed my rifle and I headed on out towards where I could hear the sounds of that coyote howling with my little dog with me. So we got kind of close to the mountainside, and there was a bit of an old road that went in, and it kind of went along the mountainside, and the mountainside was quite steep, and it was quite forested back in here, and that's where that coyote was hiding. So I got it set up in a spot there, and I was hoping that he'd come out, but like I said, we didn't have any game calls or anything like that. So there's nothing. My little dog is there, and then I'm holding her back, and she's just going crazy. She wants to get after that coyote. And so I figured, well, what the heck, I'll let her go, and we'll see what happens. Maybe not the best idea, but it all worked out fine. Let the dog go. It went, I said, Sheba, get him. And she went out maybe about 20 yards away from me. Rah, 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 she barks, and then comes back to me. Perfect. But nothing. No coyotes coming out anywhere. I'm keeping a sharp eye, watching. So I tell the dog again, I say, Sheba. She catches right onto this. I couldn't believe it. These became commands that I told her then from then on in the future when we repeated this kind of operation. I told her to go out again. Sure enough, she goes out again. This time she'll go about twice the distance away. She goes out to about 40 yards away from me. Rah, 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 rah. She starts barking at that coyote and then comes back to me. I'm watching and I'm waiting and watching. But no coyote comes out, but I can hear him there. I can hear him, yep, yep, yep. And then a little bit later, yep, 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 yep. And a little bit closer. And I know he's coming, but he wants her to get into the bush before he comes out. And I don't want that, that's for sure. So I figure I'm going to send the dog out one more time. I told the dog, go, get. And she goes out there, and this time she goes out 60, 70 yards away. And in fact, she's getting a little too far away because this road, as it goes up, it kind of has a slight incline to it like this, and then it dips over like that. So as she crests that hill, she gets onto the other side where I can't see. Well, I'll be darned if that coyote didn't know what was going on too. He waited till she got over the top. He come out of the bush. All of a sudden, the next thing I hear is ki-ying like you never heard. Man, that little dog of mine could kick up a stink when she's getting killed by a coyote. So I grab my rifle and I'm just running for all I'm worth, and I run up to the top of that hill, and sure enough, there on the other side, on the bottom of the hill, is my dog and that coyote fighting. While it wasn't much of a fight, that coyote's bearing down on my dog and grabbing it by the back, right by the back here, and trying to lift it up and run away with it while it's still alive. But she'd fight so hard that he'd have to put her back down and try to get another better grip, another better bite, and trying to run away from me. They're only maybe 20 yards away, and I bring my gun up and I'm like, holy smokes, they're moving around so much and they're so darn close. All I can see in my scope is coyote, dog, coyote, dog, coyote, dog, coyote, dog. And I'm like, I have to take a shot. But sure as heck, there's a good chance I could shoot my dog. But it's picking her up. The last time, it really bears down hard and it lifts her up, and I could tell, whoa, he's going to make the bush line with her this time. Brought up the gun, coyote, dog, no choice. Pulled the trigger at what I thought's got to be the best time. Kaboom! You're not going to believe it. Not a word of a lie, I shot that. My dog was in that coyote's mouth, right? Like this, in its mouth as it's running away, and I shot that coyote dead straight through the head. Yes, no, I'm not kidding. No, I am not kidding. Get that out of here. This is the honest truth. No BS in these stories. That coyote dropped like a sack of hammers, dead as can be. My dog hit the ground in a full run. Out of there. And that's how me and my dog Sheba got our very first coyote, and that was just the first of many. That hunt didn't go so well. From then on, I was a little more cautious of not letting her ever get out of my sight, having her on a leash, having her, you know, within 40 yards or where I could always see very well. But that was one brave little dog, because even that, getting mauled by that coyote did not discourage her one bit. And I mean, she was mauled bad. She had a lot of puncture wounds all along her back and her side. I took her to the vet. A lot of the skin had been pulled right off of the meat, and you know, this kind of in the old days. This old vet, he was an old retired guy, and you know, we didn't really do a lot of operations and stuff on dogs. You just sew them up, right? So he sewed up a few holes, and he says, well, you know, he says, leave her here for the night and call me in the morning, and I'll tell you if she's still alive. That's about all I can do. So I said, okay, phoned him the next morning. He says, you wouldn't believe it. I walk in there, that dog's standing there wagging its tail, happy as can be. I went home and got Sheba. It took her about 2-3 weeks to heal up. She was good to go. And like I said, never even fazed her for how much she wanted to hunt coyotes. That was just one of many hunts to come. Stories. All right. Hunting, fishing, camping, outdoor adventure. Send your stories in to me. I want to put them out on the interweb. I want to tell the world. You know what? Us old timers here, we got to tell these stories before it's too late. People want to hear them. We need to tell them. So send your stories in to me. info@themoosewhisperer.com. Thanks for watching, folks, and I look forward to hearing from you.